To your first flip video for our second unit about ancient Asia. The essential question I want you guys to work with here is what were the key political, economic, and cultural developments of ancient China? So we're going to be shifting our focus geographically away from from Central and South America, and we're now going to be taking a look at what's happening in China. And we're going to start with this flip video about ancient China. Many of you have studied this in 7th grade, but not all. So that's why we're going to capture some of the early stuff and then move forward into the same time period that the Maya, Aztec, and Inca existed, which would be known as the Middle Ages. So the beginning of civilization in China, the headings on the top, feel free to use those on the left-hand side of your notes in addition to terms. Civilizations developed in China, beginning with what is believed to be the first dynasty in the Bronze Age, known as the Xia dynasty. Believed to have existed from approximately 2200 to 1750 BCE, so 1750 years before the year 0, just to remind us of that BCE concept. The first known dynasty, however, though, is the Shang dynasty, and the Shang dynasty is the one there's actual written evidence thereof. The Shang dynasty, these two early civilizations began mostly in the river valleys of the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers. The Yellow River is known as the Yellow River, and it's highlighted right here. This formal name is actually the Huanghe River, but it's known as the Yellow River because when the river is the flooding and the current of the river is sort of churning, it's churning through and depositing what is known as louse, and there's less actually. I'm sorry, less, and that is then deposited on the banks of the river, and that in turn makes their land fertile. That's actually why most ancient civilizations begin on river valleys, is because that provides them for farmable or arable land. Those rivers that the civilizations began around, which you can see in the map on the left, are also known as or also functioned as natural borders for the civilization, and also, of course, provided transportation. So those are some of the key reasons of why the civilizations began in ancient China where they did. Oh, look at these fancy graphics. Okay. Second, what is a dynasty? I already mentioned this. I just said the Shang dynasty. In ancient China, when we talk about dynasties, we are first and foremost talking about dynasties that are a series of a ruling family that continues to rule for generations and generations. So that's actually what a dynasty is type of political system. So you've got one family, that, just like Jay-Z claims himself to be, him and Beyonce, and what's her name, Blue Ivy, they're that dynasty family, right? But imagine that just for a government. So there's a system of rulers years after year. The term dynasty, though, also doesn't just refer to the political system. It also refers to the period of time of that group's reign. If you didn't know what reign means, it means the period of time when they are ruling. So put reign on the left-hand side if you did not know what that was. So it says here the time period of their reign is named after the family. Let's say that let's say that Sasha and Malia now came to power after Obama was gone. Then that would be called the Obama dynasty, for example. We, of course, don't have that here in the United States, but if we did, then that would be how dynasties are enacted. The dynasty, the rule, who's in charge in a dynasty is hereditary. Hereditary means that it's passed down through the generations. The word term hereditary also applies to characteristics about yourself. So your height is based upon your heredity, for example. And so in order to be in a dynasty, in order to take power, you must be related to the previous ruler. An interesting political system can be both a source of strength and quite often a source of weakness, and we'll talk about that as we start to study ancient China, or China in general. Some of the early cultural practices of that Shang dynasty. The Shang dynasty is known for inventing writing in China, that writing system. So we see simultaneously we have civilizations far, far away from one another coming up with the exact same concepts and practices. They also, much like the Aztecs and the Maya, they used glyphs, which of course are those symbols used to represent words. And that's that same practice, the Shang dynasty. Those of you who are currently in studying Chinese, and by the way, you're studying Mandarin, you're not studying Chinese. When you're studying the language of Mandarin, you are using the same glyphs that were invented all the way back in the Shang dynasty. So that has been maintained over that entire period of time. Something that's important culturally, the Shang dynasty practiced ancestor worship, and this is a cultural component. We saw this come up with the Inca, and we're going to see it continually across our study of ancient China, that the role of the ancestors, and specifically those who kind of came before or who are older than you, is this important cultural belief. There's a certain reverence given to those older, and specifically with the Shang dynasty. They had a practice known as using oracle bones, and these oracle bones, they would take tortoise shells, which you see on the right, or the femurs of, that's your thigh bone, of cattle, and they would write glyphs on those tortoise shells or on that femur, on that bone, and then they would throw the bone into the fire. When the bone gets into the fire, that means that those people that eventually the bone is going to crack. And the way that which the bone cracked was used as a sort of source of fortune telling. So the ways that the bones cracked is an indication of what the ruler or such as or whoever should do based upon the connection between the glyphs. There was a strong emphasis in ancient China on the idea of a community versus an individual, that you must do what's best for the community versus what's best for you personally. And we're going to see that emerge when we talk about Confucianism and the philosophy of Confucianism as that was applied to better the entire society and not just better someone's specific life. The Shang Dynasty in early China, they were more secular. Secular is a word that means worldly or non-religious than some of the other ancient civilizations. And we're going to see that because what's going to take hold in China are not necessarily religious faiths on a large scale until we talk about Buddhism, but more so these are concepts of philosophies and ways of living as opposed to a specific, very rigid religious system. The Shang Dynasty has also had extensive use of jade and bronze. Jade is that pretty green stone you often see in many in Chinese jewelry. So that's some of the early techniques and earlier inventions. Just to take a look at these civilizations, to put to frame what we have been doing to what we are doing now. Actually, I'm gonna back up just a bit. So here we are, 2015 CE, of course. You can see here that we can see the Aztec and Inca begin around 1200 AD, around 1200 CE, same thing. So about 1200 years after the year 0. The Aztecs and Inca were conquered very shortly thereafter, around 1500 AD. You can see just how far back in time we are starting our discussion of China, where the Shang Dynasty began approximately 22 BCE. So we're talking about a 4,000 year time difference here. So as I mentioned, we're going to start with the Shang Dynasty, which is the earliest discussion. Then we're going to move towards the Zhou, even though it says ZH, it's actually pronounced like a J, the Zhou Dynasty, which lasted for a significantly longer period of time. Where we're really going to pick up our study is here in the period of the seven warring states, which is the period of instability in China that led to the creation of what we more commonly associate with the modern state of China. Then, once we see here, that's as I just mentioned, China is unified in 221 BCE by a man named Qin Shi Huangdi, which I'll talk to you about in just a second. Here's where we're going to see the Chinese dynasties continue from 206 BCE through 1900 CE. Now you can see how I mentioned before we were shifting our geographic focus away from the Central and South America and to China. So we're going to loop back, just see where China has been, but the most of our focus and most of our time for this unit is going to be spent in the exact same time period of the Aztec and Inca, but in China as opposed to in Central America, South America. So I just mentioned this. We had these two earliest dynasties, and eventually what those dynasties evolved into is a period of several different kingdoms. This is a little bit of a blurry picture. I can add a better one in just a second. We have this period where you have multiple different kingdoms that are all different groups that ultimately start to fight with one another over power. So you can see that China, what is not yet currently known as China, but this area, that's why it's in quotation marks, China was formally set up into those city-states. So we have that same exact concept that the Maya set up was present here in ancient Asia. These city-states were each ruled by a different king from a separate dynasty, and they were all fighting over who should rule that civilization as the emperor, the single leader. So now we see again those terms, different civilizations, same exact concepts is what we're working with ancient Asia. The seven warring states were, look at that, let me move this here. The seven warring states were constantly at war for years, and one of the things they were fighting over was this belief in what's called the mandate of heaven, which is this idea that the heavens have somehow instructed who it is that should be the leader of the civilization. So these seven warring kingdoms, I'm going to just expand this just so you can see it. You can see here are the different seven kingdoms. There is no such thing as China at this point. These are just these earliest kingdoms, the Han Dynasty, the Han Kingdom, the Qin, the Yan, so on and so forth. These are just the earliest states. And during all this chaos, it says here, amidst all this chaos, there were several philosophers who spent time developing sets of beliefs and practices that they believed would bring order to these seven warring states. They came up with 3. I'm only going to define one right now because the other 2 we're going to spend some time discussing in the next flip video. One of those theories of how the 7 warring states can come back into order was called Taoism, which is the philosophy that everything in the universe should just be. No one should take any direct action to alter the actions of the universe, the natural way of the world, which is known as the Tao. Taoism isn't particularly practical but it is a very peaceful belief. I always mention this to my classes. I always think of in that movie Finding Nemo, the guy Crush, when that turtle he's just kind of floating along. He's like just going with the flow. That's the kind of the idea of Taoism. And if we let nature just naturally exist, then all the forces will balance themselves out, and all will be well. That's where we get that concept of yin and yang from. There's good and there's bad, but there's a meeting in the middle that will ultimately balance everything out. That philosophy emerged because of the 7 warring states, that these philosophers were trying to figure out ways to draw order. 2 other philosophies that emerged are called Confucianism and legalism. Ultimately, what ended the 7 warring states was this period of time where it was the application of legalism under the rule of the Qin Shi Huangdi. So you see Qin, pronounced like a chin, like the chin on your face. The Qin dynasty was ultimately victorious. So you can see where the Qin was and the area that they ultimately then conquered. And they united China for the first time under one emperor. So now what has just previously existed as just the Zhou, the Shang, the Xia, the Qin, these particular city-state kings, is now permanently unified for the first time under China. Hence why we call this China. It's named after the Qin dynasty. So the first emperor of China, you can put that on the left-hand side of your notes or flip-flop this. Qin Shi Huangdi was the first one to rule over this entire period of time. And you don't have to recopy this, but this is essentially what I just mentioned there. He was the first to effectively unify China under a single rule, and that's why we have the Qin dynasty. And that's why we have China. So that's our basic introduction to where China, how it emerged. I mean, that was a super brief introduction. To just simply 2 analysis questions, even though the number 2 is actually technically 2 questions. Why did ancient China begin in a river valley? And what makes a dynasty an effective way to rule? What makes a dynasty an ineffective way to rule? That's it. Thanks, guys.